In a time when the soul of Israel felt crushed beneath the weight of fear, silence became the new anthem of the people. The once vibrant land, lush with green pastures and golden harvests, had turned into a ghostly wasteland. Each year, like a living nightmare that repeated without mercy, the Midianites swept down from the hills in ruthless waves, consuming everything in sight. Grain fields were flattened, herds vanished overnight, and the last embers of hope were trampled beneath foreign feet. With no walls strong enough to resist and no armies to defend them, the people sought shelter in the forgotten cracks of the earth, hiding in caves, clefts, and hollow places where even the sun struggled to reach. The land that once echoed with laughter and songs of worship now whispered only despair. Among the multitudes who faded into anonymity during those bleak years was a man who had never stood out, neither in strength nor in reputation. His name was Gideon. He was not a warrior, not a prophet, not even a man of notable lineage. He was just another farmer, desperately trying to protect what little the enemy hadn't stolen. Day after day, he labored in silence, not dreaming of delivering his people, but simply hoping to survive another sunrise. While many secretly prayed for a savior, someone to challenge the oppressors and restore dignity to their lives, Gideon was focused on separating wheat in a wine press, a pit normally used for pressing grapes, concealing his harvest out of fear it would be looted. Then something unexpected happened. Amid the dust and quiet of his hidden work, a stranger appeared. The air hung heavy with the tension of survival, yet the figure's voice carried something unfamiliar, authority wrapped in gentleness. He spoke no command from a throne, no cry to arms. It was a simple declaration spoken into the ordinary. "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Gideon froze. He looked around almost instinctively to see if someone else stood behind him. Surely those words weren't meant for him. Mighty warrior? He felt anything but that. He was a man defined by caution, not courage, by retreat, not confrontation. His heart brimmed with doubt and the burden of years spent in silence and shame. Unable to contain his bitterness, he voiced what so many had thought but never dared say aloud. If the Lord is really with us, then why has all this happened to us? Where are all the wonders our ancestors told us about? His voice cracked, torn between confusion and years of suppressed sorrow. It wasn't rebellion. It was a wounded heart seeking clarity in the middle of chaos. The visitor didn't flinch. Instead, he replied with quiet resolve, "Go in the strength you have. Deliver Israel from Midian's hand. Am I not the one sending you?" Gideon took a step back. The words hit hard, not because they were harsh, but because they seemed impossible. How could he, the youngest son in a poor family from the weakest clan in Manasseh, become the one to save an entire nation? His reply was honest, almost defeated. "My family is the least in Manasseh, and I'm the youngest in my father's house." But the messenger's gaze remained steady. He didn't speak of potential or ability. He spoke of presence. "I will be with you. You will strike down the Midianites as if they were one man." It was a promise that didn't make sense in human terms. It defied logic, experience, and expectation. Yet in Gideon's heart, something shifted. Not a surge of self-confidence, but the faint spark of faith. Fragile, yes, but present. That moment marked a turning point. Though his hands still trembled and fear still lingered, Gideon had heard something that pierced through his insecurity. A divine call. For the first time, he glimpsed a truth greater than his limitations, that his life could mean more than hiding and surviving, that maybe, just maybe, he had been seen by God. Though the divine words still echoed in his ears, Gideon's heart remained entangled in doubt. The idea that he had been chosen, he, a farmer from a forgotten clan, to deliver an entire nation, felt far too large to bear. He needed something more than a promise. He needed confirmation, something visible, something that could silence the storm within. With a voice more trembling than bold, Gideon made a request, not out of arrogance but out of sheer desperation. If this calling truly came from the Lord, if he was really meant to rise against the Midianite oppressors, then heaven would have to speak again. This time, through fire. He gathered a young goat, prepared it carefully, and baked unleavened bread. Then he laid the offering on a flat rock, treating the moment with the reverence one gives to sacred things. His heart pounded. Every breath felt like a thunderclap. Stepping back, he watched the mysterious visitor lift a simple staff and touch the sacrifice. In an instant, flames erupted from the stone, devouring the offering in a burst of holy fire. Gideon fell to the ground, trembling violently. He had not been speaking with a mere man. This had been a messenger from the Almighty. The realization was overwhelming. Fear rushed in, but so did something else, a flicker of conviction, faint but real. Still, Gideon's journey toward belief was not yet complete. Courage doesn't bloom overnight, and faith often requires a second sunrise. One quiet evening, under a sky embroidered with stars, Gideon sought a further sign. This time, it was a simple request involving a piece of wool. He placed a fleece on the threshing floor, exposed to the night air, and prayed, "If I am truly to deliver Israel, then let the fleece be wet with dew in the morning, and the ground around it remain dry." The hours crawled by. But when the first light touched the earth, Gideon rushed to the fleece. It was soaked, so much so that he wrung from it a bowl full of water while the surrounding soil was dust dry. His heart leapt, yet still a cautious spirit whispered, "What if it was coincidence?" So he prayed again, this time the reverse. "Let the fleece remain dry and let the ground be covered in dew." By the next sunrise, it was exactly so. The fleece lay dry and untouched, while the ground sparkled with morning moisture. Now Gideon knew he was not alone. God's call was not a misunderstanding. The signs were undeniable. And though fear still lingered, he could no longer ignore the mission. A quiet resolve began to rise within him, but obedience is never without cost. One night, the stars watched as Gideon prepared for a different kind of battle. Not with swords or spears, but with courage against idolatry. He had been commanded to destroy the altar of Baal and cut down the Asherah pole that stood beside it, symbols of a people who had turned their hearts from the one true God. But those idols weren't just wood and stone. They were tradition, they were heritage, they were painfully part of his father's house. Still, Gideon chose obedience. He gathered 10 men he trusted. No one spoke much. Their faces were tight with tension, hands firm with purpose. Cloaked by the night, they moved quietly toward the high place where the idols stood. Every footstep cracked branches. Every sound felt like an alarm. Fear surged in waves, but Gideon kept moving, remembering the fire, the fleece, the call. With makeshift tools, they began dismantling the altar. Rocks tumbled. The Asherah pole groaned and splintered as it fell. And when the place was bare, Gideon built a new altar, one dedicated to the Lord, and made a sacrifice there, not out of custom, but conviction. By dawn, the work was done, but silence gave way to shouts. As Ophrah awoke, anger filled the air. Crowds formed. Accusations flew. Sacred ground had been violated, at least in their eyes. Who had dared commit such sacrilege? It didn't take long for the trail to lead to Gideon. The people were enraged. Justice, they cried. Punishment, death. The tide had turned, and Gideon stood on the edge of consequence, not just for obedience, but for beginning a revolution of faith. Just when the furious mob was ready to strike, someone unexpected stepped into the fire. Joash, Gideon's own father, who had once allowed the worship of Baal in his household, stood before the crowd with a calm that silenced even the angriest voices. "If Baal is truly a god," he declared boldly, "let him defend himself. Does he need men to fight for him?" The words cut through the noise like a blade. For a long moment there was only silence, then murmurs, then shifting feet. No one could argue with the logic. Slowly, reluctantly, the crowd began to dissolve, leaving behind uneasy glances and unfinished threats. Gideon had survived, but survival came with a cost. The veil of anonymity had been lifted. No longer just a fearful farmer, his name now spread across the region. To some he was a traitor, to others a spark of courage, but to all he was known. There was no turning back. That night marked a point of no return. Gideon had struck at the heart of a corrupt system and lived. Something deeper than bravery had begun to grow inside him. It wasn't the absence of fear, it was the birth of conviction. If God was truly with him, then no enemy, no matter how vast, could stand in the way. News of Gideon's defiance spread like wildfire. Men who had once hidden in fear, farmers, wanderers, even former warriors, began to emerge from caves and forests. Whispers turned to resolve. A man had challenged Baal and lived to tell it. Could this be the leader they had waited for? They came in waves, from the hills of Naphtali, the plains of Zebulun, and the shadows of Asher. Each man brought his story, of loss, of humiliation, of longing to fight back. And around Gideon, a camp began to rise. What had started as a one-man stand was turning into a movement. He watched in awe as his people gathered. Rough hands clutched makeshift weapons. Eyes once dimmed by despair now held flickers of hope. 32,000 strong, an army born not from kings but from the cries of the oppressed. For a brief moment Gideon allowed himself to breathe. Maybe now, with this force, they had a chance. Maybe now Israel could reclaim its voice and its freedom. But just as hope settled in, God spoke again, and the words shook Gideon to the core. "You have too many men. If I grant you victory with this army, Israel will claim the credit. They'll say their strength saved them. I must show them it is I who deliver." Gideon's heart dropped. Too many men. How could that be a problem? Every warrior counted. Every sword mattered. Still, he obeyed. He stood before the assembled men and declared, "If anyone is afraid or uncertain, you are free to leave. No shame will follow you." At first, the silence was heavy. No one moved. But then, slowly, the crowd shifted. One by one, men stepped away. First dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. Dust rose as 22,000 departed. When it was over, only 10,000 remained. The blow was sharp. Gideon looked around. The camp now seemed smaller, quieter. Though the men who remained were steady, the overwhelming odds had returned. The enemy still outnumbered them by far. His faith, just beginning to blossom, was tested again. But God was not finished. "You still have too many," came the next instruction, calm yet firm. "I need to make it unmistakably clear. This victory will not be by human strength." Gideon waited, hands clenched as the new plan was laid out. He was to lead the men to a nearby stream. No reason was given, no tactics explained, but he was to observe how they drank the water. That would determine who stayed and who went. Once again, he obeyed. Under the scorching sun, the 10,000 approached the water's edge. Some knelt, plunging their faces directly into the stream. Others scooped the water with their hands, remaining alert as they drank. Gideon watched every movement. God pointed to the latter group, the ones who stayed vigilant even while quenching their thirst. "These are the ones you will take," he said. 300. Only 300 men remained. Gideon stood still, overwhelmed by the weight of it. Against an army like Midian's, it felt like foolishness. But he remembered the fire on the rock, the fleece wet with dew, the voice that had spoken, not once, but again and again. And now, surrounded by a handful of watchful, willing men, he realized something profound. The strength of God is not found in numbers, but in obedience. The sun bore down from above, casting a golden haze over the land as the 10,000 men approached the water's edge. Thirsty from the long march, they rushed to drink. Some knelt low, plunging their faces into the stream, eager to quench their thirst without hesitation. Others crouched, cupping the water carefully in their hands, eyes scanning the surroundings, alert even in their moment of relief. Gideon watched in silence. Every motion burned into his memory. This was not just a moment of rest, it was a divine test. God had instructed him to pay close attention. The men who remained cautious, those who brought the water to their mouths while remaining on guard, would be the ones chosen. When the sorting was done, the result was staggering. Only 300 men had passed this quiet, unconventional test of readiness. 300, against a sea of enemies. The weight of that number pressed against Gideon like a boulder. All logic cried out against the odds. No commander would march to war with such a handful. But Gideon had long passed the point of relying on human wisdom. His trust wasn't in strength, but in the one who had chosen him in weakness. Surrounded by this small band of alert, obedient men, Gideon understood something deeper than tactics. True power rests not in the multitude, but in unwavering faith. That night, a heavy silence settled over the valley. The stars gleamed above, indifferent to the tension below. From a distance, Gideon and his 300 warriors looked down upon the Midianite camp. Thousands of tents stretched across the plain like waves upon a dark ocean. The flicker of scattered campfires lit the night, illuminating the silhouettes of enemy soldiers moving, laughing, resting. They had no idea what was coming. As the men double-checked their cloaks and simple supplies, Gideon received instructions once again. Not a battle strategy forged by warriors, but a command whispered by the Creator himself. And it made no earthly sense. There would be no swords, no charging horses, no siege equipment. Each man would carry just 3 items: a ram's horn trumpet, a blazing torch hidden inside a clay jar, and a heart that would obey without question. To anyone else, the plan was madness. But Gideon had seen fire erupt from a stone. He had watched dew fall only where God said it should. He had whittled down thousands to 300 by divine command. There was no room left for doubt. He handed out the items, gave his orders, and divided the group into 3 equal units. Under the cover of darkness, they quietly surrounded the Midianite camp. Each step was measured, each breath held. The only sounds were the distant crackle of fire and the soft shuffle of sand beneath their feet. Then came the signal. Gideon raised his trumpet and blew, a sharp, piercing cry that split the still night. Instantly, the camp exploded with sound. Every man smashed his jar, revealing the torchlight within. 300 flames flared into the darkness. 300 trumpets blared, and 300 voices shouted with one voice, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon!" Chaos erupted. The Midianites, startled from sleep, saw light surrounding them, heard sounds from every side, and fell into confusion. In the darkness and panic, they turned on one another. Friend struck friend, and order dissolved into terror. Horses neighed wildly, orders clashed, screams tore through the night air. Not a single Israelite sword had been lifted, and yet the enemy was crumbling. Fear overtook them. The mighty Midianite army, once so confident, scattered in all directions. They abandoned their weapons, their supplies, and their wounded. Their unity shattered, their strength crumbled, and their pride was swallowed by confusion. Gideon and his men stood back and watched the impossible unfold. Victory did not come from superior numbers or polished weapons. It came from trust in a God who fights battles in ways man cannot predict. The message was clear, not just for that generation, but for every soul who would hear the tale. When the Lord fights for you, nothing is impossible. But even as the dust of battle settled and the enemy fled into the shadows of the night, Gideon knew his work was not done. Among those who escaped were 2 of Midian's most powerful leaders, Zebah and Zalmunna, and until they were stopped, the threat would remain. Though the battlefield had fallen silent, the mission was far from over. As long as Zebah and Zalmunna, the Midianite kings, remained alive, the threat loomed. Israel's freedom was incomplete. Gideon knew this. The enemy had been broken, but not yet dismantled. The head of the serpent still breathed. Wasting no time, he rallied his 300. Weary from the night's astonishing victory, their faces were smeared with dust, their bodies aching. But there was no celebration, no rest. Only a shared understanding. The enemy must be finished completely, or the peace they fought for would be fleeting. The pursuit began across scorched and rugged terrain. The sun bore down mercilessly, and every mile tested their limits. Their throats burned from thirst, their feet blistered and raw. Muscles trembled with each step, yet not one of them turned back. What they lacked in strength, they found in purpose. As they crossed into the city of Succoth, Gideon sought provisions for his men. He approached the elders with a clear request: bread for his exhausted soldiers. He explained that they were still chasing down the kings who had tormented Israel. But the leaders of Succoth, hardened by fear and doubt, refused. They would not risk retaliation from enemies who, in their eyes, might yet return stronger. The rejection struck like a blow, not just to their bodies, but to their spirit. Still, Gideon did not allow bitterness to take root. He gave no impassioned speech. He made no threats. He simply pressed on, leading his men toward Penuel. Hope flickered briefly. Perhaps here they would find solidarity. But again, they were met with resistance. The people of Penuel, too, chose cowardice over courage, silence over support. Twice denied, Gideon bore the weight of disappointment, but his resolve never wavered. His men, watching their leader remain steadfast, drew strength from him. Somehow, fatigue became fuel. His perseverance was contagious. Their journey continued across dry riverbeds, over dusty hills, and through desolate fields. Every step forward was a small act of rebellion against exhaustion, against despair. They weren't fighting for glory. They pursued something greater, lasting peace for their people. Finally, far in the distance they saw it, the last camp. The Midianite kings had taken shelter, believing themselves safe. Gideon, vastly outnumbered once more, refused to hesitate. Strategy replaced strength. He crafted a plan: strike swiftly and strike when least expected. As the sun dipped behind the horizon, the time came. The attack was sudden, like a gust of wind before a storm. Chaos spread as the remnants of the Midianite army tried to regroup, but it was too late. Surprise and fear did what swords could not, and in the midst of the fray, Gideon seized his prize, Zebah and Zalmunna, the final symbols of Israel's chains. But even now, his work was unfinished. The return to Succoth was more than a march. It was a declaration. The same elders who had refused him stood now in silence as he presented the captured kings, the living proof of everything they doubted. Without lengthy speeches or fanfare, Gideon held them accountable. He punished those who had mocked faith with fear, a reminder that doubt has consequences when truth stands before it. In Penuel, the same judgment came. Their arrogance had been greater, their defiance louder. As a warning to generations yet to come, Gideon ordered the tower of the city to be torn down. It was not an act of vengeance, but of instruction. Never again choose comfort over courage. With these accounts settled, Gideon turned back to his final task. In the presence of his men, he questioned the captured kings. He asked them about a past slaughter, his own brothers, murdered by their command. Their answer sealed their fate. With hands that had once trembled in fear, Gideon carried out justice, not driven by wrath, but by righteous duty. The reign of terror ended not with spectacle, but with resolve. Zebah and Zalmunna fell, and with them the last breath of Midianite dominance. Israel was free, not because of overwhelming might, but because one man had dared to trust, to obey, and to see his mission through to the very end. The victory Gideon secured was more than a military conquest. It was a spiritual triumph, a moral restoration, a moment when the heavy fog of fear finally lifted from the hearts of a wounded nation. With Zebah and Zalmunna captured and justice served, the air in Israel shifted. Joy replaced dread. Hope breathed again. Across villages and valleys, Gideon's name passed from lips not with superstition, but with reverence. He had become a living testament of what faith, obedience, and courage could achieve. Soon, elders and tribal leaders gathered before him. Their eyes, once dulled by years of oppression, now sparkled with admiration. But beneath their gratitude lay a deeper desire, permanence. With hearts full of emotion, they made a plea. Gideon, rule over us, you, your sons and your grandsons after you. You have delivered us from the hand of Midian. It was the offer of a crown, a dynasty, the opportunity to transform his legacy into a lineage. For a brief moment, Gideon must have envisioned it, a unified Israel under his leadership, safe from future threats, his children raised as protectors of the land. It was tempting. For a man who had once hidden in fear, the applause of the nation was a loud and alluring invitation. But Gideon's heart had not been shaped on thrones or scrolls. It had been shaped in caves, in whispered prayers, and in miraculous moments when only God could receive the credit. He knew where the power truly came from. He remembered the fleece soaked with dew, the fire that consumed the rock, the trumpet call that led to victory without a sword drawn. And so, with clarity and calm, he answered, "I will not rule over you, nor will my sons. The Lord alone will rule over you." The silence that followed was heavy. Many couldn't comprehend such a response. In a land so familiar with oppression, the idea of voluntarily turning down power seemed absurd. But Gideon's mission had never been about glory. He had been called to deliver, not to dominate. Still, he made one modest request. From the spoils of war, he asked each soldier to give a single gold earring from the plundered treasures of Midian. There was no hesitation. Eager to honor their leader, the people came forward with their offerings, piling up the gold in gratitude. With the collected treasure, Gideon commissioned the crafting of an ephod, a sacred garment, beautifully adorned, meant as a tribute to God's faithfulness. It was not intended for worship. It was to stand as a reminder of divine intervention, a visible symbol of what the Lord had done through unlikely means. Placed in his hometown of Ophrah, the ephod shimmered in the sunlight. Pilgrims came from across the land to see it. Each thread seemed to sing a silent hymn of past victories and divine protection. But time is a ruthless sculptor, and the human heart forgets easily. What had begun as a symbol of devotion slowly turned into an object of misplaced reverence. The ephod, once a reminder, became the center of attention. People no longer traveled to give thanks to God, but to revere the artifact itself. The ephod became their focus, their false hope, their silent idol. Gideon, aware of what was unfolding, watched with sorrow. Yet even he could not stop the slide. The very thing he built to honor God became a snare. The people, ever vulnerable to spiritual drift, exchanged a living relationship with the Almighty for ritual and symbolism. The ephod became a mirror of Israel's weakness, their tendency to grasp what they could see rather than trust the one they could not. It glittered with gold, but cast a long shadow. A silent warning that even the most sacred intentions can unravel when man forgets the source of his salvation. Gideon lived out the remainder of his days in Ophrah, and while his presence held the nation together for a time, peace built on memory alone could never be permanent. He was respected, he was honored, and as long as he lived, Israel remembered. But beneath the surface, old patterns stirred, and peace, so costly, so sacred, was once again beginning to tremble. When Gideon passed from the earth, a heavy stillness settled over Israel, a silence not of peace, but of uncertainty. His leadership, grounded in faith and humility, had kept the nation tethered. With him gone, the tribes lost their compass. And without direction, old patterns returned like dust in the wind. The sacred ephod, once meant as a symbol of gratitude, now stood as a golden trap. The people, without Gideon's presence to guide them, fell once more into idolatry. What had been built to honor God became the centerpiece of distorted worship, and like a sickness passed silently through generations, spiritual corruption began to spread. The memories of deliverance faded, the awe of miracles vanished, reverence was replaced by empty ceremony, and alliances rooted in fear, not faith. Once more, Israel turned from the one who had rescued them, trading divine truth for man-made comfort. But even that decay was not the end. From the ashes of Gideon's legacy rose a darker shadow. His name was Abimelech, one of Gideon's many sons, but not one shaped by his father's humility. Where Gideon had trembled before power, Abimelech craved it, not to protect, but to possess, not to guide, but to rule. With cunning in his heart and ambition in his veins, Abimelech saw what others did not, a power vacuum and a chance to fill it. He traveled to Shechem, his mother's hometown, a city still wrestling with divided loyalties. There, he appealed to bloodlines and shared heritage. He whispered promises to the elders, flattering their fears. "Why serve 70 sons of Gideon?" he asked, "when you could have one of your own to lead you?" The question planted doubt, and from doubt grew betrayal. To fund his campaign, Abimelech turned not to God, but to Baal-berith, a false deity. From that temple, he was given 70 pieces of silver, and with that silver, he bought swords. Men without conscience, killers for hire. With cold precision, he gathered his brothers, those who shared his father's blood, and murdered them. 70 sons, slain on a single stone, a monument to ambition, a throne built on fratricide. Only one escaped, Jotham, the youngest. He fled into hiding, carrying with him the last flicker of Gideon's true legacy. With no rivals left, the leaders of Shechem crowned Abimelech king. It was no divine anointing, no prophet spoke, no priest blessed. This coronation was soaked in blood and sealed in silence. From his fragile throne, Abimelech ruled with brutality. Justice died, mercy vanished, corruption flourished. His reign wasn't one of peace, it was a reign of fear. But truth, though buried, still finds a voice. Jotham emerged briefly from his hiding place and climbed Mount Gerizim. From its heights, his voice echoed over the city like thunder. He told a parable, a story of trees choosing a king. The olive, the fig, and the vine refused. Only the thorn bush accepted. "You have chosen a thorn to rule you," he warned, "one that gives no shade, no fruit, but devours with fire." It was a prophecy of ruin, a vision of what happens when power is divorced from righteousness. Yet few listened. Blinded by Abimelech's promises or bound by fear, the people of Shechem hardened their hearts. They had traded the quiet strength of Gideon for the loud tyranny of his son. Thus began one of the darkest chapters in Israel's story, a time when the son of a savior became an agent of oppression, where the sword was chosen over the staff and selfishness drowned out wisdom. But kingdoms built on blood do not endure, and power gained through betrayal always turns inward. The fall had begun, even if no one yet saw the cracks. The story, far from over, stood on the edge of collapse, and history waited to speak again. To finance his hunger for power, Abimelech turned to a shrine of deception. From the temple of Baal-berith, a false god with no voice, no truth, and no justice, he received 70 pieces of silver. With that blood-stained coin, he purchased more than swords. He bought silence. He bought terror. He bought men without conscience who would do his bidding without hesitation. And with that force behind him, he carried out the unthinkable. He summoned his brothers, Gideon's sons, his own flesh and blood, and led them to a single place. There, with no remorse, no hesitation, he murdered them all upon one great stone. 70 lives, 70 futures, all cut down for the sake of one man's ambition. Only one escaped, Jotham, the youngest, who vanished into the wilderness with grief in his eyes and truth burning in his heart. With his rivals slain, Abimelech declared himself king. The people of Shechem, either blind by tribal loyalty or seduced by false promises, accepted him, but it was no anointing. No prophet poured oil on his head. No prayer was spoken over his name. His crown was forged in betrayal, his throne built on corpses. From his seat of power, Abimelech ruled like a tyrant. Compassion had no place in his court. Justice was twisted, and truth had no voice. Fear was his tool, and corruption spread like rot from the roots. The legacy of Gideon, humility, faith, obedience, was trampled beneath the heel of a son who had learned only the lust for control. Yet one voice dared to rise. Jotham, the only surviving son, climbed Mount Gerizim and cried out to the people below. He did not shout in rage. He spoke in parable. He told the story of the trees who sought a king.